Good afternoon, everyone. It's a really great pleasure to be here. My lab in UCC, in the lab, we primarily look at how microbes within the gut, which we refer to as the microbiota, influence the brain and influence our mental processes. Now, clinically, I'm a medical doctor, but I work in psychiatry, and the patients I see, generally speaking, are suffering from severe forms of depression. That's what I do in Cork University Hospital. It pays half my salary. What I want to do today in the brief time allotted to me is just, I suppose, convince you that really microbes within the gut do play a fundamental role in regulating our emotional state. It may come as a surprise to some of you to know that we have between 1 and 2 kilograms of bacteria in the adult human intestine. And that's the equivalent of the weight of the human brain. So the actual microbes in our gut weigh the same as the brain. The biochemical complexity of the microbes in the gut actually is certainly greater than the biochemical complexity of the brain. And there are about 100 times more genes in our microbiota, in our gut microbiota, than there are in our cells. Now, many of these genes produce products that our bodies require, and specifically our brains require. And if we were to put all the essential genes into our cells, the cells wouldn't be big enough to contain those genes. So it's just as well that we've actually co-evolved with microbes. We obviously feed those microbes, and in return, they give us products which organs in our body, including our brain, desperately require. Now, what sorts of microbes are in our guts? There are a variety of microbes in our guts. We've probably all heard of lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, which are good bacteria in the intestine. And there are many bacteria whose genomes we can sequence their DNA, but we actually know little or nothing about them. And of course, there are within the intestine also, on occasion, pathogen bacteria. You might get an attack of gastroenteritis or whatever, but there are some people, and in certain parts of the world, where most of the population carry Helicobacter pylori. I mean, if you go to countries like, for example, Pakistan, 80% of the population in Pakistan carry Helicobacter pylori. And in Ireland in the past, a very large percentage of the population did as well. Over the past 20 years, we've tended to eradicate it because it's a cause of peptic ulcer disease. So there are a wide variety of bacteria within the intestine, and they're pretty essential to our general well-being. Now, how do these microbes within our intestines communicate with the brain? There are several parallel routes of communication that enable the microbes to send signals to the brain. The vagus nerve is an anatomic connection between our guts and our brain. And we've shown, for instance, in our lab, that if the vagus nerve is severed, let's say lactobacilli in the intestine are unable to communicate with the brain. Now, you might say, when would the vagus nerve ever be cut? Well, when I started off in med school, which was back in the 70s, it was common at that stage to still do vagotomies. It was a standard treatment for peptic ulcer disease. And of course, we now have far better treatments than cutting the vagus nerve. Although there's a recent study which suggests, in fact, that, well, it more than suggests, what they did in Sweden is they looked at all the people who back in the 50s and 60s had vagotomies for peptic ulcer disease. These are obviously quite elderly people now. And they asked the question, are the rates of Parkinson's disease, which is a movement disorder caused by brain atrophy, are the rates of Parkinson's disease different in these people than they are in people who have an intact vagus nerve? And what they found, to their surprise, was people who had a vagotomy back in the 50s and 60s have far less Parkinson's disease than the rest of the population when they grow old. So it seems that something beginning in the gut moves up the vagus nerve and actually results in the death of neurons within the brain, causing Parkinson's disease. Now, there are other routes of communication with the brain as well. Tryptophan, for instance. Tryptophan is pivotal in terms of regulating our mood because it is the precursor of serotonin, the most important neurotransmitter in the human brain that regulates our mood. Tryptophan is produced by bifidobacteria in our intestine, and tryptophan gets into the bloodstream and travels to the brain. We have no capacity as humans to produce tryptophan, and our brains have very limited capacity to store tryptophan. So if we're going to maintain a normal mood state, we need the intestinal bacteria to produce the tryptophan and to send it to the brain. I mean, we've done studies in my lab, and other labs have as well, where we've taken people who were prone to depression and we've depleted them of tryptophan, and within an hour or so they become quite markedly depressed. And if you restore the tryptophan into the bloodstream, the depression goes again. So tryptophan is one very important route of communication between the bugs in the gut and the brain. Other routes of communication would be, you may have heard of short-chain fatty acids, butyrate, propionate. These are produced by metabolic activity in the large intestine. And butyrate and propionate get into the bloodstream and they travel to various organs throughout the body. We have no capacity to produce these short-chain fatty acids ourselves. We're dependent on the bacteria, and certainly they do get into the brain and have important functions within the brain. Another important route of communication would be from the immune system in our intestines, where cytokines, which are peptides produced by the immune system, can get into the bloodstream and travel to the brain. So I suppose, in summary and basis, what I've said is there are several ways in which the microbes in the gut can actually influence the brain activity. Now, what determines which microbes we have in our intestine? Well, the first big determinant is how we were born. If one was born by caesarean section, it results in a certain microbiota forming over the first 2 or 3 years of life. If one was born per vaginum, there's a different type of microbiota. An individual born by caesarean section will have picked up bugs from the doctor's skin, from instruments in the operating theatre, from the mum's skin, and that will determine the microbiota over the first 2 or 3 years. Somebody born per vaginum will get the bacteria from the mother's vaginal cavity, mainly lactobacilli, and also bifidobacteria from the exposure to fecal material from the mother. Now, you might think, well, maybe that's not terribly relevant because over the first 2 or 3 years, you tend to get convergence between both sets of babies. Now, there isn't total convergence, but I think the reason this is so fundamentally important, and thank heavens, we have quite a large grant in UCC, myself and some of my colleagues, to study this. The rates of caesarean section internationally are going through the roof. If you look at Manhattan, over 50% of all babies are born in Manhattan by caesarean section, over 50% in Brazil. In China, because of the one baby family of the Communist Party, everyone wants a healthy baby, so better take the safe route and deliver the baby by caesarean section. In Ireland, it's gone up to about 35%. The World Health Organization suggests that we should have C-section rates of 10 to 12%. In Ireland, the biggest driving force is clearly litigation. There's a lot of litigation. Every time you turn on RTE, there's something on about an obstetrician being sued. But of course, there's the other issue as well, and that is there's probably, now I'm not suggesting that any obstetrician would do that, there's more money for delivering a baby by C-section than there is per vaginum. So the way in which we're delivered does determine the sort of microbiota we have. Now, what areas of the brain are influenced by bugs in the gut? Well, if you take the hippocampus, which is in here basically, the hippocampus on both sides of our brain is fundamental for memory and cognitive processes. There's a lovely paper published just on Thursday in Cell Reports showing, looking at, now when I was a medical student we were told there were you were born with a certain number of cells in your brain and you didn't develop any more. That, of course, is nonsense. We know there are stem cells in the brain and they can form neurons. But there's a wonderful study in the journal Cell Reports which shows that if the bugs in the gut are exposed to antibiotics over an extended period of time, that you get less conversion of stem cells into neurons in the brain. Now, given this is particularly in the area of brain associated with memory and cognitive function. And in our lab, we've shown we have a germ-free facility so we can raise animals without any bugs in their intestine. And we have shown previously in an earlier study that they too have major differences in their capacity for turning stem cells into neurons. So the microbiota in the intestine influences cognitive function, particularly in the hippocampus. I've already mentioned the role of tryptophan and its regulation of serotonin. I mean, iconic drugs like Prozac act through serotonin. Serotonin not only regulates mood, it regulates sleep, it regulates our appetite. And it is pivotally dependent upon bifidobacteria. I think we were the first group internationally to show that bifidobacteria ingestion increases the levels of tryptophan in the bloodstream. So that's another area of the brain impacted upon by our microbiota. GABA is an important neurotransmitter in the brain. GABA is an inhibitory transmitter. It regulates our levels of anxiety and our levels of arousal. And again, we've managed to show in our lab that lactobacilli can radically alter GABA transmission. So there are a variety of areas of the brain that are pivotally dependent upon the sorts of bacteria we have in our intestine. Now, how can we alter the bacteria in our intestine? Is there any way in which we can significantly alter? Well, prebiotics are indigestible fibers usually that promote the growth of good bacteria like lactobacilli and bifidobacteria. If you take human breast milk, it's full of inulin. Inulin is the classic prebiotic, and it does promote the growth of lactobacilli and bifidobacteria in the large intestine. Other prebiotics would be prebiotics like FOS and GOS. And my group and also Phil Cowan's group in Oxford have shown that prebiotics can actually improve the capacity to deal with stress, that it reduces stress levels and reduces the release of stress hormones like cortisol. A few years ago, you're all familiar with probiotics, and probiotics are supposedly good bacteria which, when ingested, have a positive health benefit. Mechnikov was the guy who introduced the term probiotic. A few years ago, I introduced a concept which has kind of caught on, I suppose, in the literature. It might have been a mad idea, but it seems to have caught on. I introduced the concept of a psychobiotic, and I defined certain types of bacteria as having a positive mental health benefit. And I said that if they were ingested in adequate amounts, these bacteria, these psychobiotics, would have a positive mental health benefit. And I think, I would want to make it very clear, most probiotics don't have any health benefit at all, and the claims that are made for them are utterly spurious. Some of them don't get through the acid in the stomach, and some of them have no science behind them. But that doesn't mean that there aren't probiotics out there that are being studied and that have data to indicate efficacy in all sorts of things like irritable bowel syndrome. I think within the next 5 years, we will see psychobiotics for treating milder forms of depression and anxiety. And I think that that would be a major advance, because many people, understandably, don't want to take antidepressants if they got milder forms of depression. Maybe they can't afford to go for psychological interventions, and psychological interventions are slow anyway. So I think that a lot of people would take psychobiotics which are probiotics that have a positive mental health benefit, if they were available. And I think the evidence would suggest that they are gradually becoming available over the next few years. If I might put in a plug, John Cryan and I have a book coming out shortly on psychobiotics, which National Geographic are going to publish. We signed the contract before Mr. Murdoch and Fox News took over National Geographic, and we took the check before he took it over. But we'd have probably been less inclined if we had known who was the ultimate owner. But anyway, there's a book on psychobiotics coming out in National Geographic. If I might finish on one issue, and it's the issue of extremes of life, because there are more health problems at the extremes of life when we're extremely young and when we're extremely old. And some of these do relate to our microbiotas. So that undoubtedly, most pediatricians, neonatologists, and most nurses working in maternity units will advocate breastfeeding. And clearly, that has a significant impact on the microbiota that we develop. I'm sure the IDA don't promote it because we produce over 15% of all the formula milk in the world here in Ireland, so there wouldn't be too much point in IDA saying breast is best. But undoubtedly, the way in which babies are fed determines the microbiota. Early antibiotic exposure can have a dramatic impact as well, and significantly increase the risk of, for instance, obesity later on. C-sectioned babies are far more likely to develop asthma, far more likely to develop diabetes and be overweight, and we're looking at the long-term mental health consequences of some of these issues early on in life. The issue at the other extreme end of the spectrum, which is when we're elderly, we all want to age in a healthy way. I mean, that's, I'm sure, everyone's objective is to age, but to age in a healthy manner. Well, I think what the evidence currently shows is that people who age and age in a healthy way and who are not frail when they age have a diversity in their microbiota. And that narrowing in the diversity of the microbiota is associated with poor health and frailty in people as they age. So really, I'm not a nutritionist, but really, my advice clearly would be that the broader the spectrum of one's diet and one's dietary intake, the more likely one is to have a broad spectrum microbiota. And obviously many companies are attempting to produce all sorts of food substances that might improve diversity. Whether they'll be successful or not, I don't know. But what is certainly clear is that if one wants to age in a healthy way, one needs to maintain the diversity in the microbiota. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, I think, 10 years ago, well, certainly 15 years ago, microbes within the gut were regarded as commensals that were irrelevant to our health. It's now become one of the hottest areas in medicine. The cover of Nature and Science on several occasions have had pictures of various aspects of the microbiota, and various issues of Science and Nature, which are the two biggest journals in the world, have focused on the microbiota. Why? Because we know now that the microbiota, and obviously the factors that determine what microbiota we have a profound impact on our health throughout our lives. Thank you very much for your attention.